You'll sack me.
Yeah.
Mate, this is my podcast. I own this.
You're
Without
just my
me, you'd be nothing.
Mitch, you're my editor.
All right, people, hello. And how many times have you laid awake at night thinking, what is peat and how does it affect whiskey? A recent study amongst whiskey drinkers showed that this was the main cause of insomnia within the whiskey community. So Daz and I have taken it upon ourselves today to address this topic head on. My name is Mitch Beshard, and if you've been living under a whiskey rock and have only just stumbled across the hottest whiskey podcast in the world, then you probably found Whiskey Cast and came here by accident. But you will be lucky enough to hear the magical sounds of the one and only Daz Haldane, one of the most beloved sons within the whiskey industry.
Whoa, that's a nice intro, mate. Thanks very much.
I felt like a hype man in Vegas there.
Yeah, totally. It was a proper hype man moment. Well, look, it's always a chore, and very rarely is it a pleasure here looking at your fine self and listening to your voice. Yeah, looking forward to getting into this topic. We touched on this in the last episode, didn't we? The one before Stuart.
Yep.
Got into a little bit of peat chat, and yeah, I was reminiscing actually a little bit because we did quite a lot of work on this back in the day at Highland Park and even at Diageo as well, out on the Peat Hill and Island things. So that was really good. But we've got a special guest today as well. We've brought in Mariella Romano, who looks after all things Lagg, works on Arran as well, which is great. And she's going to be talking a little bit about their kind of peated content and their whiskies as well. So to celebrate peated whiskey today, I thought we could have a wee dram, Mitch. I hope you've got something smoky in your glass.
Who's going to show first? You're going to show me yours?
You go. Yeah, show me yours.
So I've got...
And then I'll show you mine.
I bought this actually when I was on Isla. This is the Lagavulin 11-year-old, the Nick Offerman edition, which has been finished in Guinness casks.
Nice.
So I'm having a wee dram of that.
That caused a lot of people were talking about that, weren't they, when that one came out? It seemed to... I don't really know who Nick Offerman is. I know what Guinness
that's because you never watch any telly, mate.
Mm.
He's quite a famous comedian. I'd say more so over in the US.
How famous? Is he more famous than Billy Connolly?
I wouldn't go that far, but it depends where you are. I'd say he would be if you're in the US. Because
so he's a big name.
Remember, I don't know if I'd ever told you the story about when I met Billy Connolly. No. I came back. It was my first day with Glenfiddich, and I met him in a pub. And I came back to the office at William Grant and Sons in the middle of New York, really excited, telling everyone, and everyone was like, who the fuck is Billy Connolly? I was shocked. So I suppose if it was the other way around, I'd met Nick Offerman, then they would have been like, holy shit, you met Nick Offerman. But yeah, kind of big comedian. Parks and Recreation was his big kind of thing. He did a lot of stuff with Lagavulin, so hence the reason he had his own bottling. And the story with that is his dad loved Guinness. So for the first time, I believe it was the first time Lagavulin used ex-Guinness casks to finish this off.
Lovely. So, brilliant.
Really nice little dram, actually.
Yeah, no, for sure. I've gone for a little Jura. It was actually one of the island casks that we did, one of the distillery casks, which was 100% peated, and it was a full maturation in sherry. So all in, basically nothing like Jura in essence, but it was really, really tasty, and it had this lovely, like, smoky, meaty quality to it because of that combination of heavy smoke and sherry, which you obviously get a lot of in Lagavulin as well. That's a nice combination too. So yeah, very, very tasty stuff.
I tried that actually. I think either you gave me it or Mark Bruce gave me it when I was over on Jura. But I'd like to see Jura do more of that because I thought that was great.
I think there's an opportunity, isn't there? I mean, we talk about distilleries that have got not a peated house style, but run peated programs. A lot of distilleries now do that, don't they? Because of blending purposes, or like Brew Clary, you go there and you can try Port Charlotte, for example, which is delicious stuff too. And it's an ongoing SKU. Octomore as well. There's a few distilleries with that going on.
And then you see the opposite going on in Speyside. You've got Balvenie, Glenfiddich now doing peated. You've also got Benriach doing peated. But yeah, I mean, you're getting that sort of juxtaposition, and I suppose it's messing about with regionality, and which is a good thing, right? I mean, you don't always want to say like a certain flavor profile comes out of region. You want to have a bit of variety going on there,
Yeah, I think as time and innovation goes on, the regions do become less important, but they're a good starting point, aren't they, to sort of generally speak.
But anyway, on to the subject of peat, right? I thought we would tee this up and get into this before we get into all the other amazing parts of the show that we've lined up for all you guys today. So let's get back to basics here and discuss what peat is. Now, whenever I'm doing this in a tasting, Daz, I don't know about you, but I always kind of stumble across the description of what peat is, right? So I literally like found this online and I quite like it. I'm going to read this verbatim just so we get it in. So in short, it is made from
It's not made from molasses.
Molasses.
Which document were you reading?
The rum document.
Yeah, totally.
Let's start it again, shall we?
Yeah.
In short, it's made from mosses and plants that have been decomposed over tens of thousands of years without the presence of oxygen. The result is the waterlogged acidic conditions which it slowly develops. When dug up and dried, it becomes combustible. In whiskey production, dried peat is used to smoke malting barley, ensuring that the phenols in the smoke are infused into the spirit that emerges from the casks at the end of the whiskey making process.
Well done.
I need to learn that just
to
spiel that off whenever anyone asks what peat is, because I think that's a really good description.
But here, so there's two things here. One is decomposing vegetation over thousands of years, right? Doesn't have to be tens of thousands of years. It can be 4,000 or 5,000 years before it's peat. And I think the thing is that vegetation, that decomposing vegetation is really important, because that vegetation will vary depending on where you are.
Well, Daz, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. We are going to get into this.
I know. And the second point I just wanted to get onto. Let me finish.
Don't show all our cards yet.
No. I'm going to stop there. And the second part was the lack of oxygen. That's amazing, isn't it? Because when you go back in time, people, when they were having their 21st birthday party a couple of thousand years ago, would, if you lost your auntie or lost your granddad or something like that, they would mummify people and put them in peat bogs and dip them in the water and leave them there for years or months or whatever it was. But then they would bring them back out for their like significant birthday parties or, sun dances or whatever it was that they were doing. And because there's no oxygen in the water there in the peat bogs, it preserves bodies fabulously. So there are a number of peat mummies basically that have been found in Scotland that are thousands of years old, that are unbelievably well preserved. So just be careful, Mitch, if you're out there digging peat. You might dig up an old ancestor of yours.
Can you imagine that, going back to that story though, bringing up your ancestor for a little part? Let's bring up Auntie May quickly. Here she is.
Yeah. Wouldn't be a party without her. She's been dead for 10 years, man.
Brutal. Right. So, I mean, I think when we're talking about peat and the history of whiskey, right, as a lot of you guys listening will know, when we talk about our first whiskies that were made in Scotland, they all would have been peated because that was our only fuel source. Obviously, as time progresses through, we find coal, we find gas, and that takes over a lot of the drying process for the barley. But the original whiskies would all have been peated, heavily peated, when we're talking about the first style of Scotch whiskey. So arguably, when you look at these big Islay styles that still exist today, that is a true reflection of how all Scotch whiskey would have been. I think what's interesting is when you have regions like Speyside, which become so popular, they were really talked to by the blenders. Speyside did start messing about with some peated whiskey. The blenders said to them, you know what, we can get that from Islay. Don't worry about that. Just stick to that fruity, floral style of whiskey, because that's what we need for our blended whiskey here. So, you can kind of see the way Scotch history progressed with regards to peat and how it got cut out, pun intended, and how it kind of stayed in certain aspects of production.
Yeah, it wouldn't have just been flavour, though. Time is a big factor as well. Peat it's a slow burning fuel, isn't it? It doesn't generate huge amounts of heat. Now, in your kiln, if you're drying, tons of barley and driving off moisture, it'll take you a long time to do that with peat. Yeah, it'd probably take you a week, to be honest. The volumes that we're sort of thinking of at a lot of distilleries today, which is why you use coke, which is a sort of smokeless, odorless fuel. That drives off the moisture. That's what dries the barley, gets it down to that 5% moisture content level where it's stable, and then you leave it, let the peat fix for 20 days, 21 days, and away you go. So the fuel is a flavouring. Peat is a flavouring, if you like. It flavours the barley, and it was used to dry barley, but it's slow. And so that was a factor as well. It wasn't just about flavor.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's one of the things I always say to people. Peat is actually a really bad heat source.
Yeah.
But it would have been the only thing that would have been available. And then you and I, Daz, have done some peat cutting before. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I did my first one on Isla with Pinky, of all people. Legend that is Pinky, yeah, over on Lagg.
MacArthur.
I think that was, I hate to say it, mate, I think it was in 2009.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good times though, over in Isla, and you just get the peat cutter. What's it called again? Is it a tar scare? I think it is. Yeah. I think that's how you pronounce it. Mm-hmm. This long kind of spade, very narrow spade, dig it down into the wet peat, pull it up, and you get these peat bricks. Essentially leave them to dry in these, how would you call it? Like, I don't know, you kind of stack them up so the air can blow through them. And then when it dries off, then it's good to burn. So really cool to see it getting farmed.
Yeah. No, it's cool. Yeah, bit of peat cutting out there on Isla, enjoyed. And I guess the vegetation back then would have been quite, 5,000 years plus. It would have been quite green and bushy and woody and things like that. Up in Orkney, it's actually a little bit like a Nutella that you're cutting through. It's a bit different. You're cutting through very clean layers. Yarfie, moss, and fog were the 3 layers that we'd classified within the peat hill there. I know there's different words in different places for the layers, and that's about 1.5 meters as you cut through it, but it's really, really smooth. A little bit fibrous at the top, as you'd imagine, where some of the roots were from, the most recent decompositions. But then when you get right down to the bottom, it's like a big slab of Nutella, really smooth, almost no fibers left at all. But if you got it on a good day, you might get a wee axe head or a wee Viking coin or something like that,
Kind of relating to your whole pirate thing, you'd be loving that.
Yeah, it's basically just free treasure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Actually, when you hit a something that might be of historical significance, you do have to phone Historic Scotland, and it's a bit of a nightmare because it means that you have to stop peat cutting until they can come up, and they're not usually there in 24 hours. It can take them a few days, if not a couple of weeks, to get up. So it's no surprise to see that all the Viking stuff that's ever found is in the same corner of the peat hill. It's probably just popped it over there so they can carry on. Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, let's park the whole peat conversation right now. We're going to come back to that in a second. Let's talk about what's been going on in the world of whiskey. Right. First thing we're going to talk about is the world's smallest bar, which has been created by Cask 88. Now, this sits in Princes Street, I think almost for the duration of the festival, so which is most of August. They've set it up right next to Johnny Walker Princes Street, which I think is pretty funny. You can go online and you can book in a place at this whiskey bar. There's only 2 seats at it, so hence the world's smallest whiskey bar, but kind of cool. Daz, I think we should go over there and record a little episode from it. That'd be kind of fun.
I'm into that big time. Let's do that. Yeah.
So next thing I saw in the news recently was Macallan have done quite an interesting collaboration with the band Mogwai. And they've created the background music for the 81-year-old. What's that called?
The 81-year-old. It's not called The Hands. No, it's called The Reach. Yes.
So they've created a song for the 81-year-old, and they were actually up at the Distillery last month doing a gig up there as well. Quite an interesting collaboration, I thought, for Macallan to do such a sort of, I'd say Mogwai are quite a sort of left field band. They're quite out there. They're not exactly really well known. Good Scottish band.
Yeah, good Scottish band. Very creative, aren't they? Very involved in the creation of music. I know they've got a music studio in Glasgow's West End, and a couple of guys I know that are based out of there. Interesting place, definitely. But yeah, it's a cool collaboration. I mean, I think whiskey-wise, I'd love to try that Macallan in particular. I mean, some of the old Macallans I have tried up towards 60+ years are incredible. I mean, they've aged fabulously well, and I'd be really interested to see how this one is.
Is that a subtle hint, Daz, to all your ex-colleagues at
definitely.
Macallan there?
100%. That would be lovely. That'd be very kind of them. Yeah. Should they have lots of samples sloshing about of the 81-year-old? Yeah.
I'm sure they do, mate. I'm sure there's a whole warehouse full of it.
Yeah. Well, look, there was some big news there from the guys at the Lagg Distillery heading over to the west from Speyside over to Arran. Lagg, new distillery on Arran, or relatively new, is now producing a product, which is great. So I think the first product comes out very shortly. with a couple of expressions. It sounds like there's going to be a lovely element of peat coming through. Mariella's going to give us a little bit more information about what's happening at Lagg, what to expect, and what's exciting.
So we're fortunate enough to be joined by Mariella Romano, who is the Global Ambassador and Brand Manager for Isle of Arran Distillers. Mariella, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
One of the things, you know, going back to sort of our history was I decided to cycle around Arran. I remember emailing you and saying, can you hook me up at the distilleries? And it just such a beautiful cycle, taking in the 2 distilleries at the time as well. My first time going to Lagg, which we're going to chat a little bit about later on here. But yeah, you've got quite a lucky job looking after those 2 distilleries and going over to Arran quite a lot, I'd imagine.
I always say I couldn't have joined at the best, a more perfect time. I joined in 2019. Almost 4 years ago, and yeah, so much has happened. Like an island that is constantly changing and evolving, but also a company that has grown and come so far in the last 27 years. It's a privilege, a joy to have shared this journey for the past 4 years. A brand new style of bottles for Lagg Distillery in the Arran single malt, so a huge rebrand, a brand new distillery. I don't think everybody has ticked that on their list in their lifetime achievements to see a distillery literally being built, releasing distilling in the very first spirit, and then also releasing the first single malt. I know how lucky I am. I definitely know that.
Yeah, just on that then, Mariella, I mean, before we dive into talking about Lagg and things, I always talk about Arran as the oldest of the new distilleries. It came about at quite an unusual time. There wasn't a lot of action going on in new distilleries and things when Arran was built. And 20 years fast forward, 25 years fast forward, a lot's changed. There's a lot of new distilleries and things. And that story is brilliant. And I think the repack that you just touched on there as well has had a massive impact, I think, on how Arran is perceived, because it looks fantastic. It looks really, really good. And brilliant work on that. That must have taken a lot of time to get to that stage.
For sure. I mean, I always credit my marketing manager because I don't think she does get the credit that she deserves. Jackie, she's a powerhouse. She's amazing. But also the full marketing team, and obviously the full team on the island, on the mainland, and the company overall. But I joined just when that was gonna happen. So I joined kind of in the last, when the big work was already done, and I was just going around the world taking credit for it, saying thank you to everybody.
Perfect. That's what Mitch does with me.
Yep.
No, but yeah, it was a long time coming. I remember my colleague Andy calling our bottles the Frankenstein bottles, because for so long we tweaked the old logo and we took the bottle and we took the Lego obsessed, but the logo, not the Lego. And I think it was time for the company to show that maturity, and that wisdom and that experience that we gathered in the last, at the time, 24, 25 years, and actually show it in the product as well. And as I always say, the truth is in the juice. Do not get fooled. We're still the same old team. We're still the same small distillery, the same passionate people. The liquid is still made exactly the same way, but it feels so good to have a range that looks like a family. For once, they look like they all belong to each other. They're all connected in a way. And since the rebrand in 2019, we saw so many new customers, so many new awards, and so many new conversations starting, because of our whiskey, which is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. So you take all of that knowledge and all of that experience and do it all over again, right? That's
exactly.
Well, let's get on to that, Maria. I'm sure everyone's very aware of the Arran brand and Arran whiskey. It's been around for a while. Great liquids, but they might not be aware of, I suppose do you call it the sister distillery when you talk about Lagg? I know you've kind of moved everything from Arran, Lagg distillery that was all heavily peated. That's all getting done down in Lagg now, and Lagg is just unpeated as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I mean, we do call it sister distillery. We are old friends, and we have stopped producing peated spirits in Lagg in 2017. You're right. That's when we acquired land on the south end of the island. And for those of you that are now having a little panic attack, for all the Macrimore Arran whiskey fans out there, we will still bottle the Arran peated expressions. And, there'll still be out in the world. We just don't know if and when, you know, we will stop releasing Arran peated single malt. It's just common sense. The best way to explain it for me, like, you know, to people, just common sense. When you have a brand new, exciting, beautiful distillery that is producing heavily peated whiskey, that it's mostly focused on experimenting with different barley varieties, different peat varieties. It just makes sense to move that peated, you know, conversation, that peated whiskey conversation, to a new distillery, and to keep producing the Arran single malted, the core range that people love up in Lagrange, and keep that focus for the original distillery. So yeah, in a way, Lagg, I call it the playground distillery, because it's new, it's exciting, and there's so much space, there's so much scope for experimentation. We've already done some fun parallel projects in the last 3 years. We've done a classic blended at birth, like I'm sure other distilleries have done that. So 50-50 Lagg and Locranza spirit put together in cask and maturing away nicely. And the most fun actually we've done was February this year. We got a hold of 40 Calvados casks from Calvados Duran in Normandy, and they were filled the same week, 20 up in Locranza, 20 down at Lagg, and I honestly cannot wait for the day that we release them side by side, just to see how a 50 ppm spirit from the southern part of the island and a non-peated spirit from the northern part of the island will change into these beautiful casks, and just, like, you know, contrast and compare. So there are a lot of fun things that we're doing. Arran barley is one of them as well. We've done it in Locranza for the past, I want to say, 8 years. So 2 weeks a year, we get some Arran barley. But Lagg is even better because we literally see the barley fields from the visitor center windows. So we know exactly who's producing what. Is right at our doorstep, right next to our orchard trees. And for the first time this year, we actually, a month ago, if you were visiting the island a couple of weeks ago, I could have given you some Arran barley new make, which I was lucky enough to try, which was super tasty.
Don't tempt us with a good time.
You missed out. You need to come back. We have saved some so that you can try it. But yeah, the most exciting of the projects this year was the 100% Arran barley, literally grown 2 meters away from our visitor center and distillery, which was then peated up to 90 ppm with Highland peat. And obviously then distilled, you know, in our warehouse. So I'm gonna be completely honest here. We don't do our maltings, you know, it's something that we haven't really looked into, but we do have very good relationship with maltsters in the mainland that can do that job for us. And the next step is source peat, maybe from the island, maybe from Ireland, maybe from the rest of the world, and just experiment and, you know, just keep that peat, you know, ppm, sort of like peated whiskey, our focus, you know, for the next few years. We're going to release our inaugural releases soon. So the first one is coming very soon, at the end of the month, early September, end of August. And then the other two will come by the end of the year. And then the Lagg single malt will come out next year in spring. So we have like a core range product available all year round, evergreen. And once all of those are out, that's when the fire like really, really starts. That's when we can start, like, you know, distilling different things and sourcing different materials, like raw materials, peat, barley, and everything else. So the future is bright and exciting for our Lagg distillery.
So we're going to have a little chat about peat later on, and just dig into some of the practicalities and some of the realities of using peat. On Arran, have you guys ever used local peat before? Up at Locranza or at Lagg? Yeah, you have done. Yeah.
No, actually, we're not.
Oh,
sorry, I was nodding.
Yeah.
I was nodding to say I know where you're coming from, but unfortunately, we have not. It's something that we're definitely looking into at the moment, just because it's a bit hard, like license-wise document. I think the legality of it is a little bit hard to get around, but. I had a dream because when we
keep going, that was quite good. Keep going. Yeah.
You like a bit of singing on the podcast.
I do like a bit of singing, definitely.
I can do the little break, like, you know, the little break singing in the middle of your podcast episode. That when we built our warehouses, actually, when excavation was going on, we did find peat and Lagg. and all my my dreams were that like we were able to use that peat to make a peated expression, and to connect the story and the peat. But when I asked the company, when I asked my teammates, apparently it's a lot harder than that. But it's definitely something that we will try and pursue in the future. If not, as I said before, we will try and source peat elsewhere as well.
So as a company, then you're actively looking at this story of terroir with peat, and you obviously believe there is something there. I know you don't have the results yet to talk about, but that's obviously something that the company is very interested in, and it's interesting to see that happening, right?
Down at Lagg, absolutely. We really want to keep that experimentation with peat going in the future.
Yeah. And can we talk about these sort of 3 expressions that are coming out? I know it's like you're talking about different ppm levels. So what's the background between with them?
They're actually the same spirit, because at the beginning of our our journey, we decided to keep things easy. So to just produce a certain type of spirit for the first 3-4 years, and then once everything goes out, as I said before, just it just comes out. Once everything is ready, we would just release it. So they're actually all 50 ppm barley wise. We finished all the batches in different firkin casks. And that's me saying firkins, not something horrible with my Italian/Scottish accent. So they're all finishing. Batch number 1 is bourbon casks. Batch number 2 will be Oloroso. Batch number 3 will be ex-Rioja red wine cask. Or the 50% ABV, just to give it a little bit more of a humph. And it just is our way to showcase what what Lagg actually tastes like already, and how we can develop in different cask varieties. The Lagg single malt will be similar. I imagine it will be in bourbon casks when it'll come out, and obviously 50 ppm. And then I know I feel like I keep saying there's way to wait. I'm not the most patient of the people. I talk about this and wishing that I had these products with me, in front of me right now. But it will take some time. It will take a few years for us, to release all of these experimentations and all the different whiskeys. But it's a work in progress.
And from what you've tasted so far, obviously your ppm is 50 at barley. It can vary massively in the glass in the end, depending on your casks and the style of the spirit and all that kind of stuff. How is it kind of nosing at the moment? Is it quite punchy, or does it mellow quite quickly?
I actually personally think it mellows. I was very fascinated to talk to Graham Moment, our distillery manager, at the beginning when we started distilling, because it was just a work in progress, and he was trying to find out the best cats, the best speed, which distill the fermentation, everything, to tweak it in such a way that we had the product that we wanted. And I think we went in wanting that heftiness and wanted the peatiness to come through. But as we filled a lot of first fill bourbon casks, we soon realized also how well the peat was responded to the sweetness of the bourbon cask. So to quote Dave Broom, I'll say, we are really trying to get the West Coast style of whiskey, if you know what I mean. Maybe we're not in Isla territory. Maybe that's for the better, actually. We're just being ourselves. But we're very happy with how the whiskey is tasting right now, which is, there's a little bit of that, campfire smokiness. It's mainland peat, so it's more aromatic, smokiness and peatiness. But you can tell that there's definitely a difference between Lagg and Locranza. It's a much, heftier, a bit oilier spirit on the palate. The peatiness is definitely coming through with a bit more of a punch compared to Locranza, which is exactly what we wanted.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Mariella, I'm like Daz and I are super excited to try it all. So we're looking forward to that invitation where all 3 of us go over to Arran and sip some down at Lagg or up at Locranza, wherever you want to take us. Our diaries are wide open for that trip, right, Daz?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can finish that sing song when we're over there as well. That would be quite good. Definitely.
To do it. Don't I'll send you the songs. I have a whole playlist. While I'll drive around the island, we'll just
like Sonny and Cher.
We could find a karaoke bar on Broddock, right? I'm sure there's one
definitely. Over there. There's a karaoke bar everywhere, man. You just got to look for it.
We don't need we will make a karaoke bar in Broddock.
Exactly. That's the attitude. That is the attitude.
Brilliant. Well, Mariella, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you coming on the show and chatting to us about all things Arran.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you soon.
Really cool to hear from her, and I love talking to her about all this kind of stuff. She's so passionate about the brands, and always over in Arran. Great on her Instagram as well, like really cool shots of what she's doing there. But yeah, I'm interested. Well, as we record this, the liquid wasn't available for us to taste, unfortunately. So she is going to send us some of that, and we'll do that in one of the episodes in the what we're drinking section for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And not only does it sound like it tastes great, I know it looks great. Some of the visuals and stuff from the Lagg bottlings look superb. Now, Mr. Mitch, when was the last time you were on Skye?
Yeah, long time ago, mate. I haven't been to Skye since I've come back to Scotland. One of the reasons I think is just I hear all these nightmare stories about how touristy it is right now.
Yeah, it's all these camper van people like Craig Holmes.
Bloody Craig Holmes.
Yeah. King in it.
So, but yeah, I know what you're getting to here. There's a new Talisker brand home that's just been sort of unveiled, which is great to see Diageo investing even more into their distilleries, because they've already done Princes Street. They've done these Four Corners. I think Kalila's almost there. And during all that time, they've managed to get Talisker a whole new brand home as well, which is pretty incredible. I mean, I love that distillery. I'm not going to lie. I haven't heard great things recently about people visiting Talisker. So it's good to see that they're upping their game here and they're doing something a little bit different. What are the details you've heard on it, Daz?
I know that they've put in some lovely private client spaces that you won't be allowed in, but I will.
Especially after saying that.
Yeah. And yeah, they'll have a nice bar up there. And I saw some nice videos from Irvin. We'll maybe get Irvin on to jump on and give us a wee chat through actually about what's happening up there. But what I was thinking is Christmas night out. I know it's still early days. It's only August, but we could head up to Skye for our Christmas night out, mate, and do a little podcast from up there. That would be fun.
Yeah, done.
Made by the sea.
2 distilleries to go and visit there now, mate.
That's true. Very true. Yeah. Name the other one.
Terroir.
Oh, well done. He's on it today.
On it. All right, so because we're talking about peat this week, we decided to give you some interesting facts about peat that will not get you any new friends. First one is the United Kingdom contains a lot more peatland than most other countries, around about 2.7 million hectares, of which more than half is located in Scotland, which is just as well for us. Now, when we talk about peatland being used for industrial use, that's a small proportion. Horticulture accounts for the majority of the annual peat extraction within the UK. Now, I'm not sure if that's still correct, because I know down in England, they've actually banned garden centres now from selling peat. And that was a recent thing that just happened. And quite rightly so. We're going to get onto a little bit about sustainability of peat in just a second.
Cool. Peat is everywhere, mate. It's found in 175 of the world's roughly 196 countries. Depending on the method of measurement, Russia and Canada are closely tied for the greatest peat deposits. How many languages can you say peat in?
Just barely one. That's Scottish.
Yeah. I think it's torf in Scandinavian and torba in Russia.
Yeah, look at you.
In Canada, it's peat.
Showing off for your bisexual skills there.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, mate.
All right, peatlands cover only around about 3% of the world's land area, but they store almost 1/3 of soil carbon, making them the largest soil carbon store. Globally, peatlands store twice as much carbon as all of the world's forests. That's crazy.
That is crazy. And ppm, parts per million, is the measurement we use to determine the sort of phenol content within malted barley after kilning and before it's been whacked through a distillery and ends up in your glass. So we normally talk about ppm in terms of the final barley ppm, the phenol content of the barley, rather than what's in your glass at the end.
Which I think's wrong, right? I don't know how everyone listening, if they agree with me on this or not, but I think we should talk more about what's in the glass as opposed to how it started.
Well, you say that, but it's harder. It would be just for I think what you do is you end up going down this massive rabbit hole of detail that is unnecessary, right? If it tastes good and you like it, enjoy it. Don't not try it, because in the glass it's 6 ppm. Do you know what I mean? Whereas in the distillery it was 25 ppm. But because it's been fermented and distilled and matured, the phenols have dropped off. You don't want people not trying a whiskey because of that. Do you know what I mean? I know what you're saying. It's a tricky one, but...
Right, Daz, let's get back into our friend Peat, see what's going on here. We've talked about its history, how it's made its way into whiskey. Mariella touched briefly on kind of how they're going to be experimenting with different styles of peat to see if that's going to make any difference in the whiskey, which I think is really interesting, and it will be fascinating to see if there's any other whiskey makers out there that's going to start experimenting with that. Like, from my experience, I think this is something that's got a huge influence on flavor. Most people in the industry talk about terroir not having a big part to play in barley, but I think most kind of now agree that it relates to peat, right? So to break this down into its very basic form, if you try a Lafroig, which obviously is a very well-known Islay whiskey, it's renowned for that medicinal TCP character, that we've come to expect from a lot of the heavily peated Islay whiskies. Now, those guys all source their peat locally from Islay, which is then malted at the Port Ellen maltings. So then if we look at a malt that's been peated on the mainland using Highland peat, let's take, for example, Balvenie Week of Peat, there's more of this bonfire heather smoke in there. It's less of that coastal influence that's coming through, which you'd expect from Islay. I mean, you think about that peat there, it's getting lashed by the Atlantic all the time. So I think that's kind of where we're at right now when we're talking about terroir within peat. And I think it's a really sort of fascinating subject.
No, totally. I've heard this a few times. There's a mossiness and a peatiness to Islay peat.
Yeah.
Whereas on the mainland, there's a bonfire smokiness to the peat. You don't get as much of that really rich, heavy mossiness. So there is like a peat and smoke. You're almost looking for two different things sometimes, right? And it's great when you get all the little combinations and variations that are these two things dancing around.
And it's interesting because, I mean, when we talk about this, if we're going to go a little bit deeper here, we go back to 1946. And there's a lady called Kathleen Blackburn, and she started conducting in-depth examination of Barra's peat. Now, this looked at like the different plant matter found in these different areas. And from that, she began to create a map of Britain's lost and changing landscape. And she discovered that peat wasn't all the same, and it was all varied. This obviously opened up a can of worms for the whiskey industry. Then we fast forward to 2006, and the Scotch Whisky Research Institute steps in to conduct a study on different peat types from Orkney, 3 sites on Islay, Tomintoul in Speyside, and St Fergus, which is in the northeast mainland. Now, interestingly enough, they found that the St Fergus peat had more woody deposits, with the Speyside having more of that mossy component. So what this meant was that the mainland peat would give off more smoke over the Speyside peat, to your point, Daz. They also found the difference between the Orkney and Islay peat, with Islay peat again having more heather in there. So this study basically confirms that terroir does exist within peat. And Daz, I know you kind of had a little bit of a look at this study when you were up at Highland Park, right? And you guys kind of got into this a bit more when you were up there.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit on the last episode. There were quite a lot of trials in peat, or up in Orkney, Highland Park own Hobbister Moor, and Hobbister Moor looks into Scapa Flow, and it's their peat hill. Now there's plenty of peat there for Highland Park to be digging away and using that for many a year to come. But what we found on Orkney with Highland Park peat, it's the vegetation there 4,000 or 5,000 years ago was kind of as it was today. It was still very windy up there in between the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. So for tall vegetation, trees and things like that to grow, it was almost impossible. Even though it was warmer back then, it was a different type of climate. It was still fairly windy, so nothing was growing that tall. So that has an impact, of course, then on what that peat is made up of. And it was mainly shrubs and heathers. That's the main sort of makeup of those peats. And the peat beds in Orkney are quite old as well, so they are quite well decomposed. And again, that means that there's less of the woodiness and lignins and things like that sit within the peat, which would then burn and give you that kind of wood smoke. What we found was almost an incense kind of aroma, heathery kind of aroma that does come off of Highland Park's sort of smoky characters, and it is very, very soft. We called it aromatic peat at the time. You know, one of the 5 keystones was aromatic peat from Orkney, and I think it still is. They peat everything themselves through the floor maltings there, and bring in unpeated barley to the island. And what they do then is blend that together and then take it through, mashing and distilling and stuff. So yeah, a big difference in Orkney peat. Even burns with a different color. I don't know if you know that. Orkney peat burns white. Islay peat burns with a slight purple hue to it.
No, that's cool. Did not know that. Every day's a school day.
There you go.
Well, I think, Daz, what we should do is you get something on Instagram about this. Get people's comments about what different peated styles of whiskey that they've tried and what they get as their kind of difference in there.
Well, that's right. I mean, there's so many different ones now around the world, right? Smoky whiskies from all over the place that are using their own peat sources and stuff. Once upon a time, I was in Japan. I don't know if I told you this. I don't know. We've spoken about this, but I was doing a session with one of the Japanese bartender groups, and it was on peat. And we actually got some peat from Yoichi, which is on a coastal area of Japan. And we compared Orkney peat, Islay peat, and Yoichi peat with one another, and just had the blowtorches out, and we were kind of smelling the aromas as we were getting them off. And we had the whiskies as well lined up next to one another that had been influenced by these peats. And it was just so brilliant. I mean, at a very fundamental level, you can smell the difference quite significantly. Now, it wasn't a scientific test, but it was very anecdotally, a brilliant way of showing people who haven't visited all of those places, how flavor is impacted by where those things came from. And it was so obvious on the nose, really, really obvious.
That's cool. Very geeky.
Yeah, it was.
I like it.
Get the belly button fiddlers out.
So I know a few of you listening will be asking yourself, if we're digging up something that's thousands of years old here, there must be a sustainability piece going on. And yeah, you'd be right to ask that. We've kind of touched on this already, but as an industry, we account for a very small part of peat being dug up, and the horticulture guys being the villains here. But it doesn't mean that the conversation's not being had within Scotch whisky, right? And kind of interestingly enough, when we go back to 2016, Diageo funded a peat restoration project of 700 acres on Islay. And that was part of the Lagavulin 200th anniversary legacy fund. We have a small whiskey called Craig Dew whiskey, and that sources unpeated Speyside whiskey and donates some of the proceeds of its sales towards peatland conservation.
Conservation and conversation.
Yeah. I believe that's the only whiskey brand to do that, but get in contact if you know someone else who does that. And then the SWA is committed to net zero emissions by 2040, with the Scottish Government's 2020 commitment to spend 250 million on peatland restoration through to 2030. So the SWA, they've actually, Daz, get this, they've got a peat action plan, which I quite like. So that plan includes sector research to gain more with regards to less reduction in extraction, reducing emissions and damage at extraction sites, and understanding best practice, reducing emissions and runoff after extraction, and funding peatland restoration in Scotland alongside the Scottish Government, which we've already mentioned. And then the last one that I want to bring you in on here, Daz, is this this part that Edrington did, and this was back in 2020. So with Macallan, Highland Park, and Glenrothes, among their other brands, they did a partnership with the RSPB.
That's actually it goes back a lot longer than that. We were renting. When I say renting, I mean we had a relationship with the RSPB.
Actually, hold on, wait a minute, Daz. Just if anyone's listening from abroad, explain what the RSPB is.
Oh, sorry. Yes, the Royal Society for the Protection of Beshards. No, I'm only joking. For the protection of birds. So it's all about making sure that the habitats, because let's face it, whilst we talk about peat, it's a fuel that we use to flavour barley, but it's a habitat for many, many animals. And the heather moors and things where peat would usually sit underneath are a really essential part of the ecosystems of Scotland. So There's lots of birds, there's lots of voles, there's lots of wee bits and pieces, wee beasties and things that live within all these. So we have to look after them. So we'd rented out Hobbister Moor to the RSPB for £1 a year, so that they could carry out, the necessary research and things like that. They could gain access, do population counts, and just keep an eye on sort of species levels and things. So there was one in particular, which was the red-throated diver, that there was a lot of interest in. And there were cameras set up all year round, and people all over the world could log in and check these red-throated divers out, doing whatever it is that a red-throated diver does. So
it was, there's a joke in there somewhere.
Yeah, there is. So those wee guys were quite cool, but obviously we still needed access to the Peat Hill May and June. So what we would do is we would actually cut the heather away at a deep level and lift it and move it to the side. We'd dig through the peat and then would replace the heather back on top, so that we weren't disturbing things too much, and then also allowing the regeneration of the peat hill. So the relationship with the animals of the land was a really important part of that. And we took a lot of guidance also as well from the RSPB, just on how things were going on the peat hill. But then also we would manage as best we could the cutting and things like runoff. You've got to dig channels. There's a lot of water in these peat moors, the peat bogs and things. So you've got to kind of manage that as well and make sure that it's, moist enough and everything, so that all the animals that do live there normally can continue to live there, so you don't change it fundamentally. So yeah, there's actually quite a lot of work that goes into it. Usually the assistant manager at the distillery would look after it. It was kind of their responsibility to run the peat cutting, to get the team in for the summer months. And it was usually kids that were coming back from summer holidays from their uni, and quite often related to the guys at the distillery and things. So Eric Smithy was the boy that used to be the assistant distillery manager, and his son Reese would come up and work the Peat Hill and things like that, and a few of his buddies would come along and stuff. So they're all fit young guys. I don't know if I'm sure there's some females now involved in peat cutting up there as well. Historically it was a kind of man's job, but hopefully that's changed. And yeah, brilliant thing to do. A great way to spend the summer,
Yeah, it's good to hear that. I mean, I remember going up to the Cabrac, which is just outside of Dufftown, and seeing all the peat cutting that went on there, and it was ridiculous. I mean, it literally looked like an amphitheater, because that much had been done of it, way back in the day. And obviously none of that had been replaced and looked after at all. But it just kind of shows you that, like, back in the olden days, I suppose a lot of it was being done without any thought for anything, because they weren't thinking about sustainability at that point in time, and it was just a fuel source to make whiskey, right? So, and a fuel source for their fires.
Well, that's right, exactly, for the home fires and things too. Yeah. So I mean, it's one of those. It is what it is, and I think now that there's the focus and there's the interest, there's the knowledge, experience, and all that to look after these places properly. The headline I read in the paper there the other week that kind of stimulated our conversation was, there will be no more smoky whiskey. And it'll be interesting to get the view from the SWA on what their recommendation is after their action plan has been fully carried out on what the right way forward is. But it'd be a hard one to predict. I mean, I sense that using it to smoke and flavour barley feels sustainable. Using it to dry barley and fill, raised beds and fertilise gardens and stuff feels like a totally different scale of task, I think. Yeah,
100%. Right, mate. Well, I don't know about you, but that's me all peated out. Can I just say that was episode 31, and we didn't even celebrate episode 30. We totally missed that one.
Oh, it's our 30th. That's cool, isn't it?
Well, it's our 30th official episode, but I think we're actually closer to 45.
Right.
Because of all the mini ones that we do in between. So
nice. Well done, mate.
Yeah, congratulations, man.
Right, mate, enjoy your weekend. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. May all your whiskies be smoky, saucy, and delightful.
Nice, dude. Like it.
How was that? Yeah, that was a good one.
And we're out. Stop recording.